All right, so in this week's lesson, we're going to take that composition that I just played and we're going to break it down note for note so that you'll be able to play it. But the real value add is understanding the why behind the notes. So we're going to talk about how the chords were put together, why the notes work with those chords, and you're going to find that it's nothing clever. It's basic major and minor chords. We're attaching arpeggios to those chords, some scales to them. And once you put it together, you have a composition. And you'll be able to do this too with any style that you want once you understand how it works. And so that's what we're going to break down over the course of 2 videos. So in this video, we're going to go through the first half of everything. If you'd like to watch the second half, download the tab PDF file for everything. Also access the on-screen tab viewer, which is interactive. You can get all of those extra lesson materials by going to activemelody.com, go to the weekly lessons page, and do a search for EP501. I made it to the 500s, which is a big deal for me. And it just means the lessons, I hope it means that the lessons are just going to continue to get better. I'm always pushing myself to try and do some new things and look at things from different angles. And so anyway, keep that in mind as we continue this journey and learning how to play guitar. And the other thing I just want to mention, somebody always asks about this. This is a 1948 Martin 0021, which is just kind of like, I guess this is sort of my favorite acoustic guitar because it's sort of perfection. I mean, it's a little scuffed up and it's had a little bit of work done on it. It's mostly original, but I got this several years ago before the vintage prices just got out of hand. And I was one of those, I played in a guitar store and I couldn't stop thinking about it. I said, I have to get that guitar. Somebody else is going to get it and I'm going to be thinking about it forever. It's sort of like falling in love, you know. Okay, let's talk about the structure of this song. So this song is played in the key of G. We're going to talk through the chords first. That's really half the battle, is understanding the chords and sort of why they work. And then we'll talk about how to play the notes and put it all together. So your one chord is a G chord. And then the next thing I wanted to do was go to its relative minor. So the relative minor of G is E minor. It's also known as your 6th chord. But there's a clever way to get from your 1 chord to your 6th chord. There's this transition chord. And so what I played was the G, and then I went to B7, and then the E minor. Now, what is that B7? That is the 5 chord of E minor. So let this be a little takeaway for you. If you're playing a song composition and playing lead or playing rhythm, doesn't matter. For the most part, anytime you're going to whatever that next chord is, this doesn't always work, but for the most part, you can play the 5 chord of the chord you're going to. And it creates an extra amount of tension and resolve. Even if the band isn't doing it, you can kind of go there in your lead and sort of spell out what the 5 chord would be and then resolve to its 1 chord. So it's just tension and release. That's all music is anyway. If you analyze music, it's all just tension and release. So we started with our G, then we go to that tension chord, our B7, which is the 5 chord of your E minor. Now the next thing I wanted to do is I wanted to go back to my 1 chord. So from my 5 chord, I wanted to go back to my G. There's another in-between chord, tension chord, that you can use. And what I'm using here is the good old George Harrison diminished 7 chord. I think of George every time I hear a diminished 7 chord. And so what I'm doing there, theory-wise, I don't want to kind of like overdo this or overstate this stuff, but when I'm going from like this in a 1-4-5, if I'm going from my 4 chord back to my 1 chord, it's kind of what's happening here, even though we're not on our 4 chord. But I can play my 4 sharp diminished 7 chord. So if we're playing in the key of G, my 4 chord's a C, so I can play my C sharp diminished 7. And that's what this chord is that I'm playing here. So I'm playing a C sharp diminished 7. It's just a nice tension chord to resolve back to that G. So even though I wasn't playing the 4 chord there, I used that same little strategy of playing my 4 sharp diminished 7. So you can just kind of remember that. If you're getting back to your 1 chord in a song, which happens, a lot, whatever the 4 chord is of the key of your song, you can play the sharp diminished 7 of that. And by the way, if you're wondering how I know these numbers and which chords work with which chords, I'll put a lesson up on the screen which goes through the circle of fifths. And that was a lesson I did a while ago that goes into more detail about that. Okay, so G, B7, E minor, C sharp diminished 7. And then we go back to our 1 chord, which is our G. And then we go to our 2, which is our A minor. I actually played A minor 7. And then to our 5 chord, which is our D7. That's it. Those are the chords for the whole thing. And now what we're going to do is we're going to add some notes to those chords. Instead of just strumming the chords, you could do that. This sounds pretty good on its own, actually, just the chords. And in fact, do that the first time, just to get familiar with them. Okay, so what I did instead of that was my G chord. I did that instead. Now what's going on there? It sounds complicated, right? Look how easy this is. It's just my G chord. I'm just playing the 4th string, the 3rd string, strings 1 and 2. So when I think of my G chord here using the E shape, 4, 3, 1 and 2. I started with that. Now, what makes it sound a little less robotic like that is sliding into that 3rd. Slides like that, slides, bends, vibrato, it's those little things we add to our notes that give you your sound. It's like the inflections of when you're singing. You're going to sound different than anybody else when you sing because of the way that you add those things to it. It's the same when you're playing. Instead of just playing it straight, sound like a robot, you could slide into any of those. So just keep that in mind. Now the next thing that happens is strings 2 and 3 on the 5th fret. And then we go back to strings 2 and 3 out of our chord. Now what is this? That would be like your 4 chord, your C chord. It'd be like 2 notes out of your C chord using the A shape. And so that's another little thing you can think about when you're playing blues style specifically. It's not just limited to blues. You could add this to country or rock even. But it's a sort of a gospel blues thing to take your 1 chord, or take your chord, any of your chords really, and play the 4 chord of that chord. Look at that. So that's what's going on there. G, C, G, C. And so when I went, that was like hitting the C, and then I'm back to my G chord. And then I played the chord. And when I played the chord, I played a G7. That's just my G chord, like you're using the E shape. Take your pinky out of it, and then hammer on with your middle finger like this. You got to do that when you're playing kind of bluesy chords. So that's the first thing. And then we did the same shape. We just slid it up here to where I'm barring on the 7th fret. And I did a hammer on with my middle finger again. I think I did an upstroke and hit the top part of the chord. Now watch this. Now this little part here is just 3 notes. It's the 12th fret, 2nd string, and we go down to 11th fret, 10th fret. But why did that work? It's because of this note. That's the 7, or the flat 7 of your B7 chord. So when you're playing a B7 chord, that note is what colors that chord to make it have that 7 sound, which is a dominant chord, a tension chord. It's bluesy sounding. So I wanted to highlight that note. So I went from my B note, which is like, your root note, walked it chromatically to that 7. Nothing clever there. Just went right to that note that I wanted to highlight. Now the next thing I did was hit this string. So that's the 11th fret 1st string. Now why would I do that? I'm thinking chord shapes. My brain is always just thinking chord shapes. And it's really those 5 shapes of the cage system. And so when I played this, I was picturing my B7 triad here. So if I've got a B7 here, I've got a little triad up here. It's the same triad as your D7 shape in 1st position. Once you can see those little triads and little chord fragments all over the fretboard, you've basically got everything you need to be able to play anything that you want. So from the B, then the song goes to the E minor. And then I went. Now let's look at these notes. These all happen on the 2nd string. It's 8, 7, 10, back to your 8. And what's going on there? Why would I pick those notes? Because those are your natural minor scale. Those notes come out of your natural minor scale. There's somebody out there, I can already anticipate, somebody's going, oh, another scale. Now, what's the natural minor scale? Is that another scale I need to learn? Well, the truth is, if you know, and this, once I realized this was revolutionary to me when it comes to improvising. If you know your major scale all over the fretboard, you've got kind of everything you need in a way. And you can connect that major scale to the 5 positions of the cage system. So you can see that this all goes back to those 5 positions. I'll put a lesson up on the screen if you want to learn your major scale in the 5 positions. And I'm talking about being able to quickly go through your major scale, depending on where you're at, comfortably. So here's the key. This was the revolutionary part. And back to the chord we were playing over, that E minor. I said I played the natural minor scale. Do I have to learn all these scales? You need to know them. But here's the thing. If your fingers know the shapes of the major scale, you've got everything. Your fingers know what to do. So when I play my E minor chord here, using that A minor shape, now, how am I able to quickly play the minor scale, the natural minor scale, without even thinking about it? It's because it's the same pattern as the G major scale. The G major scale and the E minor scale are the same scale. See, if I started with this note, my G note, now you hear that scale totally different. It's a G major scale. But if I played it like this, and highlighted or accented that E, then it sounds like a different scale. And it is. It's a different scale, but it's the same notes. And so the thing is, though, my brain gets in the way sometimes, but my fingers know those patterns. So if you know your major scale all over the fretboard in those 5 positions that I talked about, you can improvise with just about anything because your fingers will kind of feel the intervals. They'll kind of know where they need to go. I'm telling you. Okay, that's the more complicated way to explain it. It's really not complicated stuff at all. But here's a really simple way to think about this. If we're just thinking about this one song, just take those 3 notes and connect them to this A minor shape. So anytime you're playing a minor chord using this shape, you've got those notes that you can work. And they're going to sound perfect with that minor chord. Okay, hopefully I didn't make that more complicated than it needed to be. I had to say that about the major scale. Okay, so from the beginning. Now we're going to do our diminished 7. That's our C sharp diminished 7. And after that I went... And that got me back to the 1 chord. That's just more of that same E minor scale, basically. But then I went to this note, which is on the 6th fret 4th string. I'm sorry, 6th fret 3rd string. And then back to this note. So the note I'm trying to get to is this note because it's in my G chord using the C shape. So I'm trying to get to this note. So I just went a half step down and hit that note. And then came to this. Actually, when I did it, I went like this. So that's 6, 9, and then 7. And when you play the 7, you're going to bar there so that you can play your G chord using the C shape. You just have to know this. When you look at the notes of your chord, here's a simple way to explain that. If I look at my G chord here, for example, I can take any of those notes from the chord and I can go down a half step for any of them. And so that's what's going on here. But instead of me just going like this, the timing didn't work out, so I hit another note in the scale. So I went up to the next note in the scale. I think they call that encircling a note. There's like a fancy term for it if you want to look that up. But that's what's going on. So... And then make sure your fingers are in position to play the notes of your G chord here using the C shape. So the easiest way to do that is to go ahead and bar there, so that when you're playing that 7th fret 3rd string, then while that note rings out, you can put your fingers in position to play the notes of the chord. Now watch this. We're going to go down to the 6th string and we're going to go G, G sharp, A. And then I play my A minor 7 chord, which is a really easy chord to play because you just bar on the 5th fret, all 6 strings, and then you take your ring finger on the 7th fret, 5th string. That's your A minor 7. And then after, and remember that's your 2 chord. After that I want to walk it to the 5 chord. Now look at this lick. So after I played the chord, I changed my position of my index finger, so now I'm only barring the first 4 strings, and I'm really playing strings 4 and 3 while I do this hammer onto the 7th fret, 4th string. But then there's this walk down, like this. Now what I'm doing is I know the next chord after your A minor, after the A minor, is this D7. And this note is the note I'm going for, the 3rd interval of that D chord. I'm trying to get to that note because I can hear that. And once you play this and learn this, you'll hear this too. If you're improvising and you're trying to get from one chord to the next, you'll start to hear those intervals. I was trying to target that note. So I just walked it down chromatically from the A minor to that D7. My fingers fell into position. And actually it was more like a D9 because my pinky went up here to the 5th fret 2nd string. So I played that like that. So it's like this. Now I've got a little extra time. Why not throw in the D augmented chord? I love that chord. That's another tension chord. You can use it where your 5 chord is. So whatever your 5 chord is, it would be a D7. You can take that 5 chord and just play the D augmented. And here's how I'm doing it, is I'm barring the first 3 strings on the 3rd fret, and then I've got the 4th fret 4th string with my middle finger, and then my ring finger is on the 5th fret 5th string. So it looks very similar. Actually, these 2 fingers are the same as if I just played a D7 chord like this using that C7 shape. But the difference is you're taking your pinky out of it and just collapsing the bar there with your index finger. So that's a really cool little transition chord, a nice tension chord that resolves back to your 1 chord. And I love to do the 7 chord, then the augmented, and then back to your 1. All right, that's a lot of information. Let me back up and play through that one more time, and then I'll see you in part 2 where we'll go over the second half. And if you haven't subscribed to the Active Melody YouTube channel, click the subscribe button and click that alert bell. That way we can stay in touch and you'll know when I put out new lessons, which I do every week. All right, we'll see you in part 2 after this.